Hey, good to see you again. So oil just took a nosedive, and I mean a serious drop. And it's all because of something that happened between the United States and Venezuela. Yeah, Venezuela, I know what you're thinking. Jimmy, what on earth is going on now? Well, buckle up, because this one's got layers, and it's got implications that could hit your wallet. The global economy, and definitely the political chessboard here at home and abroad. Now, before I get into the nitty-gritty of what just went down, let me just say this. If you're not subscribed to this channel yet, what are you waiting for? Seriously, hit that subscribe button right now. I'm not asking for much, just a little click, and in return, you get the real story, the context, and maybe a few jokes along the way. Fair trade, right? All right, so here's the deal. Reports started circulating that the U.S. and Venezuela have been in talks. And these aren't just your run-of-the-mill diplomatic chats over coffee and pastries. No, these are serious discussions about oil, sanctions, and possibly a major shift in how Washington deals with Caracas. Now, you already know the rules. Venezuela has been under heavy U.S. sanctions for years, especially targeting their oil industry, which is basically the lifeblood of their economy. The second word got out that there might be some kind of agreement or easing of restrictions, oil prices started sliding. And when I say sliding, I mean they dropped faster than my motivation. On a Monday morning, crude oil futures fell several percentage points in a matter of hours, and traders were scrambling to figure out what this means. Now, why does a potential deal between the U.S. and Venezuela send oil prices tumbling? Well, it's pretty simple. Supply and demand. Venezuela has some of the largest oil reserves in the world, but because of sanctions and years of mismanagement, their production has been in the gutter. If the U.S. eases sanctions and Venezuela starts pumping more oil into the global market, that means more supply. More supply with the same demand equals lower prices. Economics 101, right? But here's where it gets interesting. This isn't just about oil prices or filling up your gas tank for a few bucks less. This is about geopolitics, power moves, and the Biden administration. Well, now we're talking about policy decisions that carry over and what the incoming Trump administration might do differently. So let's dive in and see what's really happening here. Because trust me, this story is just getting started. All right? So let's set the stage here. Venezuela's been a bit of a thorn in the side of U.S. foreign policy for a while now. We're talking about a country that's been run by the Maduro regime, which, let's be honest, hasn't exactly been winning any democracy awards lately. The U.S. slapped sanctions on Venezuela years ago, targeting their oil sector specifically to put economic pressure on Maduro and his government. The idea was to squeeze them until they either changed their ways or, until something gave. But here's the thing. Those sanctions also had a side effect. They took a massive chunk of Venezuelan oil off the global market, which actually helped keep oil prices higher because there was less supply floating around. Now, according to multiple outlets, the U.S. has been in quiet negotiations with Venezuela. And the word on the street is that there's been some kind of breakthrough. Now, I'm not saying we're about to see Maduro and a U.S. official doing a joint press conference with balloons and confetti, but there are reports suggesting that the Biden administration has been exploring ways to ease some of those sanctions, particularly around oil exports. Why would they do that? Well, a couple of reasons. First, global oil prices have been volatile, and anything that can stabilize or lower prices is good for American consumers and the broader economy. Second, there's the whole geopolitical angle. If the U.S. can peel Venezuela away from cozying up too much with countries like Russia, China, or Iran, That's a strategic win. So when the news broke that there might be some kind of understanding or agreement in the works, oil markets reacted immediately. Traders started selling off crude futures because they're anticipating that more Venezuelan oil could hit the market sooner rather than later. We're talking about a potential influx of hundreds of thousands of barrels per day, maybe even more if Venezuela can get its act together and ramp up production. Now, before you get too excited about cheaper gas, let me pump the brakes a bit. Pun intended. Venezuela's oil infrastructure is, to put it mildly, a mess. Years of underinvestment, corruption, and sanctions have left their refineries and production facilities in rough shape. So even if sanctions are eased, it's not like they can just flip a switch and start flooding the market tomorrow. It's going to take time, investment, and a whole lot of work to get things back up to speed. But the market doesn't always wait for reality to catch up. The mere possibility of more supply is enough to move prices. And hey, if you're enjoying this breakdown, do me a favor and hit that like button. It helps the algorithm, and it helps me know you're actually paying attention and not just playing this in the background while you fold laundry. Fair. So what's the reaction been like? Well, it's been all over the map, and that's putting it lightly. Let's start with the political side of things here in the U.S. You've got different camps reacting in very different ways. Some analysts and lawmakers who've been critical of the sanctions are saying, finally, a pragmatic approach, let's lower gas prices and reduce our reliance on other oil producers who aren't exactly our best friends. On the flip side, you've got folks, particularly on the Republican side, and some hawkish Democrats, who are not thrilled. They're arguing that easing sanctions on Venezuela is essentially letting Maduro off the hook, and they're worried it sends the wrong message about human rights and democracy. You can almost hear them saying, so we're just going to forgive and forget. What about all the people suffering under that regime? And, you know, that's a fair point. This isn't a black and white issue. There's a real tension between economic pragmatism and moral principles here. Then you've got the oil industry itself, and let me tell you, they're watching this like hawks. U.S. oil producers aren't exactly thrilled about the idea of more oil flooding the market because that could drive prices down and hurt their bottom line. But at the same time, refineries in the Gulf Coast have actually been importing some Venezuelan oil, even under the sanctions framework, using special licenses because that heavy crude is a good fit for their equipment. So there's a mixed bag of reactions even within the industry internationally. This is causing some ripples too. OPEC, the oil cartel that tries to manage global supply to keep prices stable or high, depending on how you look at it, is probably not doing cartwheels right now. Saudi Arabia and other OPEC members have been cutting production to prop up prices. And the last thing they need is a bunch of new supply coming from Venezuela, messing up their plans. And then there's Russia. Moscow's been a key ally of Venezuela, propping up Maduro with financial and political support. If the U.S. manages to peel Venezuela away, even a little bit, that's a strategic loss for Putin. So you can bet the Kremlin's watching this closely and probably not loving it. Back here at home, you've got everyday Americans who are just looking at the gas station sign and hoping for some relief. And honestly, who can blame them? Gas prices hit people's wallets hard, especially if you're commuting every day or driving for work. So any news that might bring prices down a bit is welcome. But here's the thing. Oil markets are complex, and a lot of factors go into what you pay at the pump. Refining capacity, distribution costs, taxes, and global demand all play a role. So even if crude prices drop, it doesn't always translate immediately or fully to cheaper gas. And still, it's a step in the right direction, potentially. let's dig a little deeper into what's actually happening behind the scenes, because this is where it gets really interesting. According to reports, the talks between the U.S. and Venezuela have been going on quietly for a while now. We're not talking about big splashy announcements with photo ops and press conferences. This has been more of a back-channel diplomacy situation, with officials meeting discreetly to feel out what's possible. Now, one of the key sticking points has always been Maduro himself. The U.S. has long insisted that any normalization of relations would require serious political reforms in Venezuela, including free and fair elections, respect for human rights, and releasing political prisoners. Maduro, for his part, has been resistant to giving up power or making concessions that could weaken his grip. So how did they get to this point? Well, it seems like there's been a bit of give and take. Reports suggest that Venezuela has made some gestures, maybe releasing a few political prisoners or agreeing to certain electoral conditions. And in return, the U.S. is considering easing some sanctions, particularly those that directly impact oil exports. It's a delicate dance, and both sides are trying to get something out of it without giving up too much. Now, here's where it gets a bit speculative, but based on patterns we've seen before, it's reasonable to think that there are other players involved in facilitating these talks. Countries like Brazil, Colombia, and even Norway have played mediator roles in the past when it comes to Venezuela. They have diplomatic relationships with both the U.S. and Venezuela, and they have a vested interest in regional stability. So it wouldn't be surprising if they've been working behind the scenes to help bridge the gap. From a purely economic standpoint, the potential for more Venezuelan oil on the market is significant. Venezuela's oil is heavy crude, which requires more refining than lighter crude, but it's also cheaper and there's a lot of it. U.S. refineries, especially those in the Gulf Coast, are actually set up to handle heavy crude, so they'd be able to process it efficiently. If sanctions are eased, you could see a pretty quick uptick in imports, which would add to the overall supply in the U.S. market. But, and this is a big but, Venezuela's production capacity is severely degraded. At its peak, Venezuela was producing over 3 million barrels a day. Now, they're doing something like 700,000 to maybe 1 million barrels a day on a good day. It's going to take significant investment and time to get those numbers back up. So while the market is reacting to the actual impact on supply might take months or even years to fully materialize. And hey, if you're still with me, go ahead and hit that like button and subscribe if you haven't already. I promise I'll keep making this stuff as interesting and clear as possible. Deal? So what does all this mean for the future? Well, there are a few different scenarios we could be looking at here, and honestly, it's still too early to say exactly how this is going to play out. But let's think through the possibilities. First, if the U.S. does ease sanctions and Venezuela starts ramping up production, we could see a meaningful increase in global oil supply over the next year or two that would likely keep oil prices lower, which is good news for consumers. Cheaper gas, lower heating costs, and less inflation pressure on goods that depend on transportation. That's all positive stuff. But there's a flip side. Lower oil prices hurt U.S. oil producers, especially those in shale, who need higher prices to make drilling profitable. So you could see some job losses or reduced investment in the domestic oil industry. It's a trade-off, and policymakers have to weigh those competing interests. Politically, this is going to be a hot topic, especially with the Trump administration now in office. Trump's been pretty vocal about energy independence and supporting American oil production. So it'll be interesting to see if his administration continues down this path of engaging with Venezuela or if they pump the brakes and take a harder line. There's also the question of what this means for Venezuela itself if sanctions are eased and oil money starts flowing again, does that stabilize Maduro's regime, or does it give the opposition and civil society more breathing room to push for change? That's a genuine question, and the answer depends a lot on how the money is used and whether there's any real accountability. And then there's the broader geopolitical picture. If the U.S. can normalize relations with Venezuela, even partially, that's a win in terms of reducing Russian and Chinese influence in the region. It also sends a signal to other countries that engagement and diplomacy can work, even with regimes we don't particularly like. On the flip side, it could be seen as the U.S. being willing to overlook human rights issues when it's economically convenient. And that's a criticism that's going to come up for you and me, the average person just trying to make sense of the world. This is a reminder that oil is about so much more than just what we pay at the pump. It's about global power dynamics, economic strategy, and the complex choices that governments have to make. And sometimes those choices don't have easy answers. So what's the bottom line here? Oil prices dropped because the market is betting that more Venezuelan oil is coming. Whether that actually happens and how quickly is still up in the air. But the fact that the U.S. and Venezuela are even talking is a significant development, and it's worth paying attention to. As always, I'll keep you updated as this story unfolds. If you found this helpful, make sure you're subscribed, hit that like button, and drop a comment below letting me know what you think. Should the U.S. engage with Venezuela, or is this a mistake? I'd love to hear your take. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.